Good to see everybody. I have 15 copies of the lesson for tonight, and I think we have about 15 individuals. If you want to pass them out, Zachary, thank you. Individuals and couples. Right before the COVID restrictions kept us isolated, I got about 20 questions in 2 days, which was fine, but I wasn't able to do the March one, which was right after the restrictions set in, and then we did not do the April or May one, so most of these questions have come from that original list. Question number 1, what is the relationship of Israel to the church in the system of theology called dispensationalism? The relationship between Israel and the church is explained differently between classical dispensationalism, revised dispensationalism, and progressive dispensationalism. So I included a little bit of history for that. By the way, the scriptures had no formal organization at all until during the Reformation. John Calvin wrote originally it was a pamphlet that he completed at the age of 24 called Christian Institutes. 5 editions and 2 very large volumes later, it was his question and answer format covering the main doctrinal beliefs. And he pretty much spoke for those in the whole Reformation. But it wasn't until the early 1700s that a German theologian organized everything in the scriptures around 2 covenants, neither of which are found in the Bible: the covenant of grace and the covenant of law. Actually, I should put law first and grace second. And that's pretty much the only system that was used by individuals. It was grounded largely on Reformation teaching. But in the early 1800s, a man named John Nelson Darby proposed what he called dispensationalism. Dispensationalism, beginning in the early 19th century, so the early 1800s, until the present, is a way of organizing all the scriptures around periods of time that had specific rules. Dispensations are distinctive ways in which God manages the relationship of human beings to himself. It's not different ways to get saved. Now, that was a problem in the original form of dispensationalism, classical dispensationalism. But it is what God commands people to do, to be doing his will. And a good practical example of that, pardon me, and I don't want to take time to figure that out. All right, so technically, thank you, brother. Technically, a Dispensation is a distinctive way in which God manages the relationship of human beings. Yeah, down. Yeah, that's good there. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. I think that's the highest. Oh, it does? Okay, thanks. There have been three broad periods or forms of dispensational thought. The first is now called classical dispensationalism, and it lasted about 100 years. In its earliest form, 1850 to 1950, and took a while to get off the ground, so to speak, and it didn't have a very good reputation initially. John Darby wanted people to bring their Bibles to service. Nobody did that up until then, and the reason was he would ask them to read certain passages with him and then explain those passages. And Spurgeon said that it was a rather strange thing, he thought, for people to bring their Bibles to church. He was not very much in favor with that and looked down on the Plymouth Brethren. That's what the name of the group was, and how they had these strange practices like bringing their Bibles to church. It wasn't until the early 1900s when the first study Bible was published by Oxford Press, and it was called the Schofield by Cyrus Ingersoll Schofield. It was called the Schofield Reference Bible, and it was the first study Bible ever to be in print. It was affordable, and it was filled with notes explaining dispensationalism. And at that point, the movement really took off. The old Schofield Reference Bible, it was called after the 1960s because in 1967, the new Schofield Reference Bible was published, and that combined with Bible conferences, that was also a new thing. Very strange, the Northfield Bible Conference, where D.L. Moody held annual conferences, Northfield, Massachusetts. If you ever have the chance to go, it's worth it. The site is still there. They still pass out interesting things like a list of everybody who ever spoke at the Northfield Bible Conference. And you may recognize some names that will be very surprising to you of people who were allowed to speak there. But classical dispensationalism, by the time we got after World War II, had really had such difficulties that people began to realize, many people began to realize that there was a need for revision. You say, what kind of things? Schofield's note in Exodus 19 saying that people in the Old Testament were saved by keeping the law. In the New Testament, they were saved by believing the gospel. So that, of course, is wrong. And this mistake and others not like it necessarily, but others really began a motivated movement called revised dispensationalism. Began in the late 1950s, went till the 1970s, and then beginning in the late 1970s, a third movement called progressive dispensationalism took hold, and it is the most common form of dispensationalism today. One of the problems with this is there are still people who only will read the old Schofield Bible and who practice classical dispensationalism, or who believe it. And there are people who teach revised dispensationalism. You say, what in the world is the difference? Well, all I'm going to explain tonight is the difference between Israel and the church. Okay? So I won't even mention classical dispensationalism and their positions, but only revised and progressive. When I got saved, my pastor bought me a new Schofield Reference Bible. That's the one he read at church. By the way, I was saved in 1975. And that's the one he preached from at church. So that was my Bible. That was the Bible I marked up a great deal as a young Christian, being taught by a very gifted and knowledgeable Bible teacher in the church that I attended. Revised dispensationalists viewed the church as a parenthesis. Here is Adam and Eve in the garden, and at the end of that, after the flood, along comes a guy named Abraham, and through Abraham, God's covenants established permanent promises made to God's people Israel. So now throughout the Old Testament, you're dealing just with the nation of Israel. In the beginning of the New Testament, you still have the end of this Old Testament period. For instance, John the Baptist being the last of the Old Testament prophets. And all of a sudden, at Pentecost, we have a new institution, only mentioned rarely in the Gospels, an institution called the church. And very different circumstances under this institution. For instance, we are encouraged to trust in Christ for the saving of our souls. That was a new emphasis. That's not a strong message throughout the Old Testament. The Old Covenant for Israel. The words covenant and testament are interchangeable. And so under that old covenant, they had the law. They were to obey the law. Where they failed, they were to offer sacrifices. They were to live in Israel. How did Israel do with that responsibility? They failed miserably, repeatedly. They worshiped idols. And it was so bad that God finally took the northern kingdom. He divided the kingdoms between the northern and southern kingdoms in 722 BC. He took the northern kingdom into captivity, and they never came back. They stayed dispersed throughout the world. In 586, after three defeats at the hand of the Babylonians, the southern kingdom was finally taken into captivity, and they did come back about 70 years later, and everybody wondered what was supposed to happen then. Were they abandoned by God? No, they weren't abandoned by God. But now we have something brand new coming on the scene with the arrival of the long-expected Messiah, prophesied in Isaiah 7:14, which is our verse on the bottom of our name for the Lord. And this is what revised dispensationalists taught, that along came the church, and it was like, set Israel aside, now we have the church. And as soon as the rapture takes place, the church is going to leave the world, and then we go back to Israel for everything else. All of Israel's promises made to Abraham and his descendants, all of those promises would be fulfilled to Israel in the 7-year period of tribulation and in the 1,000-year period called the millennium. Okay? So, this parenthesis between Israel under the old covenant and Israel under the new covenant was a new institution of God without any direct connection to either one. And you'll often hear about the dichotomy between Israel and the church. They were not to be confused. In fact, in the earlier stages of revised dispensationalism, they were going to live eternally on a new earth in a new millennium. And the church was going to live in heaven with God, a new heaven and new earth, but completely separate from the Israelites. Then, as we mentioned, in the late 1970s, around 1980, progressive dispensationalists, actually at a meeting of the Evangelical Theological Society in the United States, somebody recommended the name. We're making revisions on this system of theology. We should call it progressive dispensationalism. In this particular scheme of theology, the church is seen as participating in and inaugurating some of the blessings of the new covenant. Under revised dispensationalism, the Sermon on the Mount was just for the kingdom of the millennium. It wasn't for anything else. But now we participate in some of the blessings of the new covenant revealed in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. The church is precisely redeemed humanity itself, both Jews and Gentiles, as it exists in this dispensation prior to the coming of Christ. Coming meaning the rapture of Christ, the second coming. Old Testament believers will participate in all the glories of eternal life, just as church dispensation believers will. All right, so that's how the church relates to Israel, a little bit differently from the revised to the progressive dispensationalists, and that's only in a nutshell. There are whole books written about this. And then just to let you know, from the other side of things, non-dispensational theology typically viewed the church as the fulfillment of all the promises God made to Israel. So Israel ceases to exist as a separate entity. The church is the answer to all the promises made to Abraham. In other words, they have to be understood allegorically. They cannot be understood literally, because we have a land. Well, that's just the church existing in communities in the world throughout the church age. So when I say the prophecies were understood allegorically, I mean a land was not really a land, and events were not really events. Those are just pictures of what the church is like. It's a good question to ask, since in theology, the relationship between the church and Israel is probably the largest, certainly one of the largest questions that theologians ask. And isn't it interesting that we go 1,700 years before we have a clearly defined systematic theology? You go to pretty much any Christian college today and you'll have systematic theology. It's taught everywhere. But there was no such thing until the early 1700s. And there was no dispensationalism until the late 1800s. There's something called the progress of doctrine. And this is an example of that, how this the church progressively understands more and more about theology. All right, any questions about that? I enjoyed doing a whole bunch of reading just to write those few paragraphs.
Yeah, I've seen some churches, I went to one, and as soon as they started
Yeah. Yeah. It's very difficult to understand why God would just use symbols when his use of them covers over 30% of the entire Bible. Why devote so much time to something that doesn't mean what it says, but is only symbolic of other things? And nobody really agrees what it's symbolic for. So, yes, Zachary.
So I do have a question, but just carrying on that thought. Also, the writer of Hebrews, he said, they said that Abraham was looking for a king, and looking for a city that was not yet to come anyway. So he believed that there was a promise that was given to him.
Right. The only thing that they believed about the people of Israel was that they would only ever live on the earth. They would never go to heaven. And the church was different in that church converts to Christ would go to heaven. Revised did, yes. Okay, a different form of it. All right, question number 2. The individual said, it seems to me that many Christians today would battle with all kinds of modern idolatry in some form, worship of iPhones, movies, television, pornography, greed. Let me just say right off the top of my head, I don't know that Christians battle with these things as forms of idolatry. I'm sure that the main problem they battle with in these areas is just the overuse of these things. I've known people, for instance, to sit in front of the television for 12 and 14 hours playing a game. And quite honestly, that's a wretched way to spend 12 or 14 hours, especially if you're doing it 3, 4, 5, 6 times every week, 52 weeks out of the year practically. That is not healthy, and that's probably the main difficulty. And we're going to see how we define idolatry. So problems in these areas, TV, pornography, greed, yes. Worship, that I think would be a different thing. But this person goes on, would this mean that they are to be excluded from Christian fellowship, even for worshiping, say, their iPhone? Well, yes. If you're going to worship a smartphone, it should be a Samsung. Certainly not an iPhone. No, I'm teasing. I was just kind of amused. This person is obviously really concerned about iPhones. Then another question follows that. How can they be saved if idolatry is in the list of marks of unsaved people? That's a good question. It seems that we can be saved and still struggle with many forms of idolatry, and that's true. Could you expand and explain a bit more of your understanding of idolatry? I think probably the primary reason we in Western culture do not understand idolatry is because we have not been raised with it. We have been raised to believe in one God, and a God for roads, and a God for buses, and a God for my car, a God for everybody else's car. In Hinduism, over 6 million deities just seems rather foolish to us. But it's not foolish to those who were raised in it. Do you have a question, Nick? Okay, we'll talk about some of that. We'll talk about that, okay? So don't go too far ahead. So idolatry is the worship of some material image as a deity. Okay? The various terms associated with idolatry are found more than 150 times in the Bible. Outside of Israel, the Canaanite cultures, were they idolatrous? Yeah, and we're talking about polytheistic here, okay? Many gods, okay? Egypt, one of the greatest nations in the ancient world, not so great today. Polytheistic? Yes. Not anymore, but mainly because of Islam, not because they've reputed polytheism. Greece, polytheistic? Yes. Persia, polytheistic? Yes. Rome, polytheistic? Yes. Self-servingly, but still polytheistic. It wasn't until Christianity pretty much took over Europe in a corrupted form under the Holy Roman Empire, but in a revised form, a less corrupt form under Reformation theology. And then there was a movement to explore to the West that included Canada and the U.S. and South America and so forth. But I don't want to get into the responsibility of having to define everything. I remember as a very young Christian understanding for the first time that the Roman Catholicism that I was raised in, which was very tamed compared to Quebec Catholicism, very, very tame compared to Mexican Catholicism. But we were taught from the time we were quite young to genuflect in front of a statue on either side of the altar. One was a statue of Saint Joseph and the other a statue of Saint Mary. And I just thought that that was something you did. And while you were kneeling, you would do the sign of the cross. And those are expressions of what? Of adoration, of reverence. And I didn't think of anything that I did as idolatry until I understood why we did that. And of course, the priest said it was to show respect. But, I mean, it's really tough to respect a piece of ceramic, which is all it was, which was all any of it was. So when I say Christianity kind of took over, well, we're talking about idolatrous Roman Catholicism. And that's not real Christianity. So idolatry is not something we were raised with in that sense of the term. Okay? Idolatry can indeed be, by the way, let me back up. The definition was broadened in the New Testament, Colossians 3:5, where covetousness is equated with idolatry. Ephesians 5:5, a broader definition should be expected since idolatry is common to every sinner. Mark chapter 7, verse 22 says, Jesus is saying, out of the heart of man comes, and then he lists idolatry as one of the sins common to every human being. So there is a movement in the direction of making anything in my life more important than God. That's how depravity works. Okay? Can idolatry be a temptation to genuine Christians? Yes. John the Apostle warns believers in 1 John 5:21, little children, keep yourselves from idols. Why would he have to say that? Because many of them that he was writing to struggled with that. And it's hard for us to think of struggling with. Many of you grew up in, however the religious training was, you wouldn't even think of bowing in front of a ceramic statue of somebody, or doing the sign of the cross, or showing any kind of reverence or adoration of a human being. But for some, it is a very common thing. The first time I took my wife to the cathedral, where we spent a lot of our youth in Charleston, South Carolina, she got up and ran out of the church crying. And I caught up with her on the sidewalk. I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "Those people really think God is hearing them. They really do." And that was just tragic to her, that people would pray all their lives, never, ever to be heard by God. But for me, it was the way things were. It was a Saturday. It was confession day. Everybody was coming and doing, making their confession and then praying their prayers of penance, and now they were clean. They could go and sin all they wanted for the next week, as long as they went to confession a week later. So Paul says the same thing in 1 Corinthians 10:14. "Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry." How many of you have read the Confessions of Augustine? Confessions of St. Augustine. You ought to read that. It's very good. It's a Christian's testimony about what life was like in the 5th century, the 400s. And he talks about discipling a friend of his who had made a profession of faith, but he couldn't stop the friend from going to what? Gladiator shows. And he talked about what a horrible sin gladiator shows were, because they killed human beings which are made in the image of God. And yet we don't have a single compunction about flipping on the television and watching it happen on show after show after show. So very interesting how we define, as Nick said, how we define idolatry. But we are talking about the worship of images. There is a sense in which idolatry is covetousness and things that we put in front of God. But we did not grow up in a culture where we revered images, where we asked them to make wives pregnant, where we asked them to grow our crops, where we asked them to do practically everything. We did. But there are people all over the world today who still do that. Question of why idols in Western culture are so different from the images that other cultures worship. It's arresting to us. We walk into a Chinese restaurant and we see an altar. I mean, it's right there by the door. And if you ask what that's for, they put food there. They dedicate their food there. They don't want to be very specific. But that image represents some ancestor for most of them. So it is a specific person. So on the back of this, I attached in the last 2 pages an article by Kevin DeYoung talking about why idolatry was so attractive in the ancient world. Because he says it's about attractive to moderns as beet juice is. Which I'm guessing he doesn't like beet juice very much. He just said it's not very attractive to modern people, but really he's only talking about modern Westerners. I have a son who's been in China with his family for the last 13 years, and it's extremely common in China. I had a sister who went with her husband to Japan and planted churches for 18 years. It's extremely common in Japan. So there are places, I already mentioned India, there are places in the world where it is very, very common. And even if we're going to broaden the definition, it is clearly worldwide. What would our society be like if nobody had anything more important in life than God? I mean, you give that some thought. Would this mean that they are all excluded from Christian fellowship, even for worshiping, say, their iPhone? Worshiping an iPhone is very different from spending too much time on it or any other piece of technology. But if someone has a problem controlling the time they spend in any activity and they refuse to change, at some point it may become necessary to separate from them because of their disobedience. However, such a move ought to be a last resort and only with a view to restoring fellowship. C, and how can they be saved if idolatry is on the list of marks of unsaved people? I mentioned one of those lists, 1 Corinthians 6:9. Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither, and there's actually a long list, and I took the whole list out except for the word idolaters. Neither idolaters will inherit the kingdom of God. So he's using this verse to make his point and say, then are people like this unsaved? Well, if you look at the other sins in the list, are these things that Christians can struggle with? And the answer is yes. So does that mean everybody who struggles with any form of idolatry is a lost person? Well, no, certainly not. Because it can be a struggle. By the way, for every Christian, it is a struggle. If you've just made up your mind you're not going to change any of those sinful ways in your life, you're going to live the way you want to, no matter what the Bible says, that's a very clear indication of your spiritual state. And what would that state be? Lost, not saved. So, the test of genuine conversion is change. Christian spirit-wrought transformation. The Thessalonian Christians turned to God from idols. But some Christians have a more difficult time putting all of that idolatry behind them, just as many of us still battle with covetousness. This is the context of the 1 Corinthians 10 passage that we quoted above. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. Whatever Christians are tempted with is a common thing to mankind. God is faithful, and he will not let you to be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. Therefore, because that's true, because we can resist it, he says, my beloved, flee from idolatry. You can flee from it. You don't have to do that. For that matter, there's no sin that we absolutely have to commit. All right, any questions about that? Did that answer enough of your question, Nick, or comment? Okay. Yes, Lee. I didn't hear that. Can you say up a little louder?
I had a question from another brother, or a claim from another brother from the church, who said that the cross could be like a form of idolatry. I said, well, if you bow down to it, sure, but it's not really like, you're not bowing down to it. Is that?
Yes. Are you asking me if that's true?
Yeah, or like, what is your point of view?
Do you remember the story in the book of Judges where Gideon made a wasn't Gideon, it was Moses who made, and it wasn't in Judges, he put a brass on a pole, and all they had to do was look at it, and they were healed from the bites from the fiery serpents. Well, during the time of the Judges, that thing started to become an object of worship. It was never intended to be an object of worship. The cross does represent what Christ did. It doesn't represent Roman punishment. I mean, people don't put a cross around their neck so they can commemorate crucifixion as a form of execution. So in that sense, it is a symbol, but we have to be careful not to allow those symbols to take on, to become objects of worship. They can be. Bibliolatry is the worship of some Bible. I should regard my Bible with respect, but I don't have to bow down to it. If the Bible was dropped in a Roman Catholic service, I was an acolyte for 8 years. If the priest dropped the Bible or one of the altar boys dropped the Bible on the floor, there was a whole scheme of things you had to go through. It was worship of the book itself, not what it said, obviously. So we have to be careful not to make those symbols of Christianity objects of worship. For that reason, the pastor my wife and I sat under for 11 years used to change the words of songs. And one of them was, "So I'll cherish the old rugged cross." And he said, no, you sing it, "So I'll cherish the Christ of the cross." And I always remember that, because what he's trying to do is direct your attention to what's appropriate, not a wooden beam. And the Catholic Church became famous for this. Before Calvin wrote his Institutes, he wrote tracts. And one of the tracts he wrote, I did this for part of my church history reading when I was in seminary, was that there were enough pieces of the cross sanctifying Roman Catholic altars in Europe to build more than one of the arks that Noah built. Because people were revering that piece of wood. And I must say, it's not that difficult to do. I get excited when I get to go to Israel. And I saw in 2012 when I went to Israel that the whole southern steps of the Temple Mount had been excavated since I was there in 1981. And so you walk up and you say, we know that Jesus and his disciples entered through this entrance into the temple area. Wow. When we were at Oxford, my brother-in-law and I and my sister and my wife, for our 31st anniversary, we went into the room where the Holy Club met. I mean, the room, and they actually had a chair with a brass plaque on it. This is the chair that John Wesley sat in. I want to sit in it, see if it'll rub off on me. So, it is easy to get caught up with those things. You have to be careful not to. Yes, Zachary.
I know that you said Quebec Catholicism and then Mexican Catholicism, which are probably Ukrainian Orthodox, which are about in there as well. You said that these are really progressive, or the Roman Catholicism that you practice and the volunteer use,
I remember finding out, this was after I got saved and I went to a Bible school, and someone came and said, "You really had to pay for masses when you were growing up?" And I said, "No." "Well, why not?" I said, That was never part of my Catholicism. We never had to pay for a Mass. I got paid for serving at a Mass as an altar boy, but I never had to pay for a Mass. And I found out at the same time when I began doing some reading that in Quebec they had statues that cried, statues that bled. And I remember thinking, good grief, this is nonsense. Who would believe in that kind of trash? And I grew up Catholic. See, but they do in Quebec. We went to a church, and the whole side of one of the walls is filled with crutches from people who miraculously were able to walk. Okay? Now, I think that's nonsense. But because Roman Catholicism is not a Christian religion, I don't doubt that demons can give people the power to walk. But the idea that these churches are impressive because miraculous works are done there. There was no miraculous work done in our church. I didn't even know there was anything sanctifying the altar in our church. And our parish was the second oldest in all the U.S. The only Catholic church older in the U.S. is in Baltimore, Maryland. And it's called Maryland because of Mary. So yeah, there are differences. Roman Catholicism is not a monolithic religion. It adjusts itself to areas of the world, the cultures of the world that they work in. You really need to read a history of Catholicism to see that.
Are Christian missionaries that go to Catholic-based places, I know that there's persecution everywhere, but do they get violent?
I think it depends on where you go. I have friends in Ireland, and they've had things happen to them, not open confrontation, but constant thieving of their property and nobody else in the whole area. But I've also had friends in Italy, and there it's no. Catholics in Italy seem to be very nominal. They're like Mormons in Utah. Most of them just don't care about Mormonism. They're just that because they were raised that. Yeah, the same would be true. And in this case, you're Catholic by culture. All right. How can they be saved? I mentioned that they would turn from their idols. Any other questions about this idea of idolatry? There is a very good passage, or actually chapter on this in the new contemporary, I think it's called Contemporary Theology series, put out by the Southern Baptists. And the title of this one, it's the doctrine of God, and the title is Like No Other. And the author is John Feinberg. Okay, if you're interested in following up on that. Question number 3. I can't see the clock. Oh, I do have a watch. Okay, I have a few more minutes. Let me see if I can't get through these last ones. Did you have your hand up, Nick? Oh, Stephanie. Okay. We're taught that the 10 Commandments are in effect today, but we no longer follow all of the Old Testament regulations. Why? Since our belief is in the literal translation of Scripture, are there so many applications of the commandments? For instance, why is the Sabbath no longer Saturday? Thou shalt not kill is murder and not just killing, since God clearly mandates wars and other righteous death punishments. And kill can also mean anger in the heart. How can the Scripture be literal but still subject to widely varying applications. Also, why are the Ten Commandments in effect, but not the other Old Testament laws? Also, why do some believers today hold to some of the Old Testament laws, things like food restrictions, clothing laws, Sabbath worship, etc.? That's a lot of questions. Okay? Old Testament laws are of three kinds: civil laws for the nation of Israel, ceremonial laws regulating the worship of Yahweh, and moral laws governing Israel's daily moral behavior. Moral laws are of permanent application. All 10 of the commandments, by the way, let me comment on this way to divide up laws. It's not as easy as it sounds. There are some laws that are difficult to figure out which category they go to. So, when I build a house, I have to put a parapet around the roof so that people can't fall off. Is that a moral law or is that just a civil law? Why do I put the parapet up there? So that no one will fall off. I mean, if they're dumb enough to walk off the edge, why should I care whether they do that? Because I am responsible for the lives of other people. So, is that a moral law or is that a civil law? Well, it has elements of both in it. Should I be concerned for the welfare of other people? Yes, I should. So that would be an example. Let's see. Moral laws are of permanent application. What is moral in the Old Testament is moral in the New Testament. All 10 commandments are moral laws. The civil laws only apply to the nation Israel. The ceremonial laws were all fulfilled by Christ and have objective application to Israel as they prepared for the coming of Messiah. Galatians 3:24 says that the law was our schoolmaster. The ESV uses the word guardian. That's a poor translation of the term. The schoolmaster is someone who teaches students to prepare them for life. And that's what the law did. It taught the Israelites to be ready for the advent of Messiah. Why are there varying applications? They really aren't applications. What this person is talking about here is not an application at all. It's just an explanation. Let me explain first the idea of Sabbath. The word means rest. It never referred to a day except the end of the creation week. Sabbath refers to the activity or the lack of it, because it's a day of rest, that God wanted his people to do on that day. Rest from gainful employment and worship. But even then, who worked on the Sabbath day on a regular basis in the Old Testament? Priests did. You're reflecting something we've taught from the Gospels when you say that God did. Of course, God in his providence controls everything every day of the week, every moment of every day of the week. He works on the Sabbath day. And Jesus uses that as a reason for him doing it in John chapter 5. So to say that Saturday was the Sabbath, number one, there was no Saturday when the Sabbath was instituted. But why did the day change? Why did it change from Saturday to Sunday? Yeah, why did they meet on the first day of the week? Because that's when Jesus rose from the dead. So the day itself was changed, but the principle of the Sabbath never went away. In fact, the principle of the Sabbath is to be lived out for all eternity. It is a Sabbath rest, Hebrews chapter 4. That's what eternity is is a Sabbath rest. So it was instituted the creation week before there ever was a law. And in fact, people knew what was required of the day in Exodus chapter 16 before there was ever a Sabbath law instituted. So the Sabbath is a permanent institution. It's not applied to different days. It is something that was explained. The idea of thou shalt do no murder, that's the original commandment. Someone's basing their understanding of that on the King James, thou shalt not kill. The word never meant just to kill. It always meant to commit murder. So the commandment in its original form in Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy 5 always meant you shall not commit murder. And there are exceptions to the killing, as this person pointed out, because God instituted those exceptions. There were 14 capital crimes mentioned in the law that required the execution of the perpetrator. Okay, so Sabbath activity is retained in terms of you shall not murder. The Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, if you're angry with your brother, you'll be liable to the judgment. Why? Well, because all of the commandments Jesus was explaining the intent of prohibits not just the act, but even the thought of the act is a violation of the command. I don't have to actually take someone's life to commit murder. All I have to do is have the kind of anger that would issue in that, and now I've violated the command. That's the same as what other commandment? Adultery. Thou shalt not commit adultery. But if you look on a woman for the purpose of lusting, you've already committed adultery in your heart without ever doing anything physical. And the Lord is explaining the intent. He's not making an application of that. Why are the 10 Commandments, this is under B, still in effect, but no other laws are? Other laws are in effect. All the moral laws are in effect. Do I still have to be concerned for the well-being of other human beings? Yes, I do. And that's just an inference from a law that has civil applications too. But I mention here the most commonly quoted Old Testament verse in the New Testament is Leviticus 19:18. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's not one of the 10 Commandments. But it is one of the commandments that Jesus told the rich young ruler he had to obey. All right, so the person is mistaken thinking that it's only the 10 Commandments that are still in force. All the moral laws are still in force. Why do some believers hold to some Old Testament laws that most believers do not? I make the statement, mature believers do not keep the civil or ceremonial laws because there is no New Testament reason for doing so. Are there some believers that do? Yes, immature believers sometimes do. They feel like they should. Why? Because it says in the Old Testament, you should. I've known Christians who've gone through that, struggled with that. Of course, outside of believers in groups like the Seventh-day Adventists, they do it as a mark of their doctrine. They only meet on Saturday. They will not meet on Sunday. They restrict themselves in eating to the Mosaic food laws. But this is to make themselves acceptable to God, which of course you cannot do. All right, any questions about that, the laws? All right. Yes, sir.
So, for in regards to the Sabbath, it doesn't have a specific day, but it's the principle behind. Let's say your work schedule is you work Wednesday to Sunday, you got Monday, Tuesday off. If you wanted to say, hey, Sunday is going to be my day of rest, or however long that was job, you're still good on that side, right?
What's the problem with what he just said? He said if I worked Wednesday through Tuesday or whatever, and I work all day Sunday, then I'm okay as long as I take my day of rest when I can. What's the problem with that? Yes. As long as whatever day you're taking, it's not just a day of rest, it's a day of worship. Can you gather with the rest of the church on your day off? A good rule of thumb for working on Sunday is I won't unless I absolutely have to, and then I should consider not being paid for it, because it's gainful employment that's prohibited. And as you read through the Old Testament, that becomes clear. Okay? So, should policemen work on Sunday? I hope they all do. Nurses, doctors, yes, I hope they all do. So there are people whose profession comes under, it is good to do good on the Sabbath day. All right? And studying those 6 passages in the Gospels where Jesus corrects the Pharisaical idea of the Sabbath is very, very helpful for us to understand how we should regard the Sabbath. But there really are a long list of things that people do, other people won't do. So some of it depends on personal conscience, but there are some basic requirements. All right, it's already 8:15. I think I'll save the other 2 for next month. And if you did not get your own copy of the notes for this, just email me and I can send you the digital copy of this. Or I'll give you my tablet, whichever you want.